Good evening, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here. My name is Ivy Sweeting, and I will be moderating the conversation this evening. I am the Associate Executive Director of the Boston Faith and Justice Network. We at BFJN are on a mission to call and equip Christians to live just and generous lives. And as a part of that mission, nearly 2 years ago, we began this uncomfortable conversation series, where in it we seek to learn from one another about issues of injustice from those with lived experience, those doing the work, and those with expertise. From there, we offer ways to engage in continued learning. We at BFJN believe, as followers of Jesus Christ, that we are called to this work of justice and generosity. And we hope that this evening will be a way that helps us all find ways to advance his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. We recently finished reading the Rethinking Incarceration book by Dominique DuBois Gilliard. And although that book club has ended, the issue of mass incarceration has not. Before America's era of mass incarceration took hold in the early 1970s, the number of individuals in prison was less than 200,000. In 2019, the total was 1.4 million, and more than 200,000 people are serving life sentences, 1 out of every 7 in prison. More people are sentenced to life in prison in America than there were people in prison serving any sentence in 1970. That data includes life without parole, life with parole, and virtual life, which is 50 years or more. Today, that number of the total incarcerated in the United States is roughly 2 million. There has been a 500% increase of incarceration over the last 40 years. Changes in sentencing laws and policies, not changes in crime rates, explain most of this increase. These trends have resulted in prison overcrowding and fiscal burdens on states to accommodate a rapidly expanding penal system, despite increasing evidence that large-scale incarceration is not an effective means of achieving public safety. Racial and ethnic disparities plague the entire criminal justice system from arrest to conviction. Despite long-term declines in youth incarceration, the disparity at which Black and white youth are held in juvenile facilities has grown. In the US, Black youth on average are more than 4 times as likely to be detained or committed in juvenile facilities as their white peers. Here in Massachusetts, Black youth are 7 times more likely, to be exact, and the Latinx population are 4 times more likely. The style of tonight's conversation will be slightly different, as I will be engaging more in conversation given my experience and passion of working with youth involved in the juvenile justice system, in addition to moderating and implementing questions for my fellow panelists, Jessie Crossan and Cheryl Sweeting. Full disclosure, as you may have recognized, the same last name, Cheryl Sweeting, is my mother, and I will try my best when directing questions towards her to call her by name. But if I slip up and say mom, please give me grace. My overall mission is to offer alternative paths to success to young people by bringing them hope, particularly high-risk youth, ultimately allowing them to see, utilize, and leverage their God-given gifts. And I came to this space of working with youth about 8 years ago when I first began working with Systems Evolved Youth as I exited my college years. Aside from my work with BFJN, I also serve as the director of Boston Reentry for Straight Ahead Ministries, and I serve as well as the DYS liaison for one of the grants we received at the onset of this year from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. This issue matters to me because I have seen it affect my family, my friends, and the community in which I serve. I think I have talked enough for now. And so I certainly welcome Jesse and Cheryl to introduce yourselves, provide any biographical information you would like, and why the issue of mass incarceration matters to you.
Sure. My name is Jesse Carlson, and I basically spent half of my life in prison. Just after my 18th birthday, I was arrested for a robbery and a non fatal shooting. I was sentenced to 32 years, which was twice the high point of the sentencing guidelines, and I served 19 years before receiving a pardon from the governor of Virginia. Now, the reason my story is kind of different or unique is that I had support and I had resources and I had the tools to really change my life while I was inside. I was able to get an education and get training and mentor other people, so I've been successful. What I saw inside and what I've especially seen upon release is a lack of resources, a lack of support, and a lack of opportunity for the vast majority of people. So when people say, why do you care about this or why are you passionate about this? It's because I have had these opportunities and I want to make sure that other people have the same, because fundamental kind of like fairness and fundamental caring and fundamental love for, each person is giving them the same opportunities and then judging them by the same standard, not starting out in two fundamentally different places and saying, hey, why do you keep falling down or why can't you just lift yourself up?
Mm, that's very powerful. Thank you so much. And Cheryl?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for asking me to be on the panel this evening. I come tonight because number one, I was asked, and always want to support my children and my loved ones. So I have over 30 years experience in the human service world in Massachusetts, mainly in Boston. And my path changed as my passion changed, and I felt as though there was a void in the system. I started out of college in residential treatment programs. My concern was that those children were being serviced and then they were being sent home to their families that weren't being serviced. So I moved into the Department of Social Services, it was called in those days, in Massachusetts, state agency, now called Department of Children and Families, to try to service the whole family. And at that point, I was an adolescent worker. The identified client in the family was the adolescent. And then I saw a lack of services and how the services were being provided. So I moved into the coordination of services being provided. I left for a short period of time and went into the private sector. It was a good experience that I had, but I had an opportunity to come back at the regional level in Boston and do more contract management, because there was a lot of gaping holes in the services that were being provided and the accountability or lack thereof of the service providers. And so my experience just grew from there. I also have experience with a lot of injustice, starting in the home and the family that I was in. And then when I had my own children, just seeing the injustice that took place. So I became part of that system as far as advocating, not only for my family, but the community. And I did retire at an early age. And I now have a very fun job with the Boston Red Sox. I'm an avid sports fan. And I got involved with the Boston Red Sox regarding their social justice equity. Once, things hit the news, that's usually how things happen. Something hits the news and then people react. So I've been a very vocal voice with the Boston Red Sox on a lot of their boards regarding social justice, and can share my lived experience. And I find that very helpful amongst my peers to be able to do that. So again, thank you for asking me to be here this evening.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this platform is definitely a space in which we want to uplift the voices of others so that their voices can be recognized, whatever, issue of injustice they may be facing. And I know we focused a lot on mass incarceration at the beginning of this year as we did our series, but as I mentioned, mass incarceration hasn't ended. And from my work on the ground level with youth and young adults in the city of Boston, there have been some things, although numbers in certain areas have declined, I have seen some things increase. And so the first question that I have particularly is for Jesse, and that can you share some about your work that you are doing with the Second Chancer Foundation?
Sure. So I started a nonprofit in a kind of backwards manner. I knew I had a lot of passion, but I didn't know what to do with it. And I didn't have a clear formulated plan and then go out and raise money. I had someone approach me and say, "Hey, I believe in you and what you're doing, and I want to give you money to do it." And I said, "Well, I don't know where that is." And he says, "Well, then you have to figure it out." So we've kind of been exploring exactly how we can do what you said, which is lift up the voices and empower the people that are in the best position to provide change, which is not having someone coming from outside of a community, but having people with lived experience and having community members that are already doing the work and facing the challenges, and then resourcing them with whatever they need, with training, with support, with finances, to make sure they can provide the best services and they can have the largest impact. So we're currently providing adult reentry services that were designed by a man who'd been incarcerated for 28 years, along with a professor of special education at UVA. So we have a curriculum we're doing that we're going through our pilot program now. And then I was really focusing on the adult side because that was my own lived experience. And we had essentially a gang war start in Charlottesville. We had a number of shootings, and they were all 14 and 15-year-old kids. It was this tragedy of saying, hey, we're missing something. Kind of like Cheryl said, like, these youths are not being serviced or their families aren't being serviced. What can we do? So we kind of pivoted. We're still doing the adult services, but we've been into the juvenile facility twice. And what we found is an incredibly understaffed, overworked group that cares, but just doesn't have the resources to provide a difference or to make a difference. And we have a disconnect between the youth and the people providing services. They're of different socioeconomic status, they're of different races, they're of different experience, and there's a lack of kind of conversation that's happening. So we want to go in. We have the person who's running my reentry program, as well as a violence interruption unit, and myself going in. And what we found was the kids, based on our experience, were willing to listen, and we're willing to talk, and we're willing to engage in a way they weren't willing to with the staff. So we're trying to be the kind of conduit, and we're trying to be the messenger of basically the things they're already trying to do. They have a pilot DBT program that I think is amazing and will resource these kids with the skills they need to cope emotionally and interpersonally, but they don't want to hear it from the people that are currently telling them. So we can go in and say, okay, this is how it helped me. This is how I've applied it in my life. We managed to get DBT training for the person running my reentry classes. But again, the fundamental principle is saying, how can we find the people that already have answers? Because when somebody from outside of a community tries to come in and tell people what to do or tell people what the solution is, they're never going to have the same fundamental understanding as somebody who is struggling on a daily basis within that community and has faced those challenges. So we're trying to find those people and those voices and lift them up.
Amen. Amen. There's so many things, gems, as I call them, that you have mentioned, those with lived experience. You have a background, a history, but how do you utilize that to move your community forward? And like you said, those from the outside coming in, they may be experts, they may have book smarts, they may have what have you. And yes, they do provide some benefit, but knowing, the foundation, the thread of that community and what your personal struggle is does add so much value. At Straight Ahead Ministries, about 75% of our reentry staff have lived experience. And so to that same model, that there's so much that you can add. And so I appreciate all of the work that you are doing. Cheryl, I want to ask, it seems so weird calling you that, but anyways, given your experience with various different systems, whether it be family systems, education, or governmental systems, can you share with us your viewpoint of the intersectionality of mental health, child abuse and neglect, and incarceration?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I did a lot as far as interagency, and some of that, I kept pulling in different agencies to be able to address the need. So I do think that there, is a great deal of connection with child abuse, with mental health, and substance abuse. And as I had said in my introduction, to be able to treat each individual in the family and then the system, the family as a whole unit, to be able to address those needs. I believe that children live what they live what they've learned in life, and they get that from one generation to the next, and it continues to get passed on. So to be able to, as has already been talked about, to try to break that cycle and to be able to pay attention to each individual's needs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I recognize that in my work as well. In fact, I was in court with a young person this morning for various hours. And, the young person is currently incarcerated, but mom was there, with no support, no resources. And so I'm thankful, to be used as a servant of God to, identify the needs in both the family, and the young people, because if the whole family unit is not serviced, there's still going to be gaps and traumas and things where the ball can certainly be dropped. Um, and so I'm going to move forward. The next, slew of questions are just general for any of us to chime in. So once someone is declared to be a quote unquote criminal, or they are incarcerated, why are they so easy to heavily punish, be forgotten about, or continue to be punished even when they get out of prison? And then a follow up to that is it a psychological or a spiritual issue on our part, or something else that you may identify?
I think that we have a large population that has a zero sum game mindset. They feel like there are only a limited number of resources, and if I don't get them, you're getting them, or if you're getting them, I'm not getting them. And this mindset has limited us to create the kind of old tribal ideas of us and them. And once we can label someone as an other, it's very easy to dehumanize them. It's very able to mistreat them. It's very easy to say we don't want them in our society. And it's a lot easier to do that or say that than it is to actually say, hey, let's do the hard work of having these conversations. Let's have these uncomfortable talks and let's figure out what we can do. And unfortunately, we start this in childhood. We take kids who have problems, who have needs that aren't being met, who are coming from abusive homes, and then we don't give them the services they need. We suspend them from school. We push them away because it's easier to push them to the sidelines than it is to say, hey, how can we help? Like, how can we address this? How can we make sure the families have the needs they have? So we do this, and then when they become adults, well, it's really easy to stick them in a prison and say, okay, we don't have to look at them anymore. We don't have to deal with them. We don't have to address our role in this. We don't have to address our cultural, societal role in allowing these things or even perpetuating these things. So I think it's both a matter of kind of concern for resources or scarcity, and it's also way easier than taking accountability because societies, and especially like cities or units, don't like to be honest about their history, don't like to be honest about their dynamics, because it's really uncomfortable to realize that your privilege often comes at the cost of someone else.
Mm, your privilege often comes at the cost of someone else. Uh, I see you shaking your head, Mom, Cheryl, as well.
Yeah, so true. A lot was said there. And it reminds me of people saying like, not in my backyard, when you're talking about, a program or a service that's being put into place. People don't want it in their backyard. They don't want to be part of it, yet they are part of it. They're part of the community. And, the term lived experience was something that was starting to be kicked around when I was leaving state service. And, what the benefit of that is to clients, and to hear the message from someone that knows it and has definitely lived that, and it presents its challenges. And I think we've done better with that, over time. The majority of my friends are people that are, have worked in the system as well, or are still in the system. I think that happens because you can't, share some of the stories that we know with people that, work in a bank, because they just don't get it. They don't want to hear it. They don't believe it. And I've had that share of that experience as well, so definitely why I'm shaking my head.
No, absolutely. And, one of the things, Jesse, that you mentioned, or the word label, there's in criminal justice, there's definitely the labeling theory, which, whether you label somebody as a delinquent or a criminal, that tends to carry, throughout their life, whether they're in custody or in the community. And so there's a scripture that comes to mind, that life and death is in the power of the tongue, and how, we can speak life into somebody or speak, into a negative pathway. And yes, there are certain people that have made mistakes and done things that they are not particularly proud of. But if that doesn't carry them throughout if that doesn't follow them throughout their life, they'll be a lot more successful in seeing, people as others, or, they're not seen, so they're not heard, they're not cared for, they're, out of sight, out of mind. And one of the things that I found very troubling about my work, where it first began, was that the juvenile justice facility was directly across from a cemetery. And there were multiple points where I would hear staff say that either the young person was going to be here in the facility or there across the street in the cemetery. And what that does to a child. These are individuals that are under 21 or under 18 years old. And we all know, or many of us know, that, our brain is not fully developed until the mid 20s. And so when we start taking on, what people are saying about us and how we're being treated, and, not having resources, what that does to a person and how that trickles into the community, and is so disruptive to, us as society. And I definitely think it is, both a psychological issue and a spiritual issue. And especially as, a servant of God and working for Boston Faith and Justice Network, we want to understand what our role is in this. And my next question touches slightly upon something that Jesse, you had mentioned as well. Can you share your opinion or your thoughts on how true this statement is? Outsourcing discipline from within the school sends kids to the street and or the criminal justice system. I know for me, I immediately think of the school to prison pipeline.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's what I mentioned before, because discipline, we look at discipline as a matter of correcting behavior. And yet what we have are not the tools to correct behavior. We say you're doing this wrong, but we don't give people the tools they need to do it right, or to recognize even what they're doing, or recognizing what their lack or what their need is. We respond to someone misbehaving, and rather than saying, okay, you clearly have a learning disability, or you clearly have trauma in your life, or you clearly have an unsafe environment at home, so you're acting up for attention, and we respond to that by then sending them home, or by then chastising them, or by then putting them in school suspension. We don't resource them. So doing that is, again, beginning that pattern that is kind of pushing people to the side rather than dealing with what we can do, with actually making a difference. And it does directly lead people to prison. I can't tell you how many people that I know have been suspended from school, gone to the juvenile facility, and then ended up in adult prison. And when we look at the kids, when I go into that juvenile facility, I love the kids who were in there for the shootings recently. Are my favorite kids. They're the smartest, they're the most charismatic, they're the most alive. They just have no direction and they have no support. And then what we're dealing with locally is the law says that when they're released from juvenile detention, they're supposed to be back in school within 72 hours. It is regularly taking 6 months for the school system to process them back in. So you take a kid from the juvenile detention center where he was actually doing well, he was going to class, he was kind of growing, put him back in the environment in the home that led him to the juvenile system to begin with, and don't even allow him to go to school, so he has nothing productive to do at this time, and then wonder why he gets locked back up. We have a system that is fundamentally shunting people to the side rather than resourcing them and rather than treating their needs.
Mm. And I know before you mentioned, the resources or understanding, that if a young person is acting out behaviorally, they may be experiencing trauma. One of the other things that I recognize in, school suspensions, or, a young person that's leading to, led to the streets because of things that are happening in school, some of those young people depend on, being served lunch and a meal that they are guaranteed to have every single day. And now when they're in the community or at home and they don't have food on the table, or they're hungry, the length that they may go to get food. I know I've worked with a young person in the past who had robbed a bank, or allegedly robbed a bank. And he, mentioned, my little brother doesn't have a winter coat, or, we don't have food on the table. And so I had to do what I had to do. And like you said, I often use a saying that these young people are young people that ask for love in some of the most unloving ways. I find so much joy in my work every single day by meeting with clients who are seen as, or, labeled gang members, or, high risk youth, or what have you. And yes, they are high risk because of what they've been through. And if we look at those root problems and address that versus saying, okay, you're suspended, you're expelled, or you need to be on X, Y, and Z medication, then how much more successful we would be in society.
Well, just one side note, I wanted to add this because this was one of the most heartbreaking things. Is we had these two kids come back to the juvenile facility, they're brothers, and they keep coming back and they keep coming back. And finally, one of them broke down and said, "Look, this is the only place we're safe. Nobody in here has a gun. Like, nobody in here can actually hurt us. Do you understand why we keep coming back? Like, I love my brother and I can't watch him shot like all my friends." When you think about that reality and then you think about what we're doing, we're punishing someone who's afraid for their life, and their response to that is to find security and safety the only way they can. And again, rather than saying, hey, it'd be a lot cheaper to relocate this person or put them in independent living or give them support, we're going to pay to incarcerate them and not actually provide the safety or security they need.
That's making me think of clients in particular that I have worked with and that have shared similar things. And one of those brothers is no longer here, as he was murdered last year. So that's very real as well, that they don't have to look over their shoulder. They may get in a fight, but they're not going to die. I saw you took yourself off of mute. Did you want to say something?
Yes, it's so very true how, you talk about what's really going on. And a lot of times as we're having uncomfortable conversations, people that work in the field don't ask those questions. They go based on the behavior and try to develop a plan from there versus figuring out what's really going on. And I can remember early in my years of working as a caseworker and having to go to court, a judge getting mad at the child for continuing to come back to court. And it probably wasn't even a criminal matter. In Massachusetts, they have this thing called CHINS, Child in Need of Services. I don't know if they ever changed it. They were supposed to change it to FINS, Family in Need of Services, instead of keeping the focus on the child. And the judge got mad and said, if you come, I see you here again, I'm going to send you to some farm in Ohio. And I spoke up and said, Your Honor, are you really going to send him to a farm in Ohio? And I got called to the chambers and, I got yelled at, and I said, why say that if you're not going to do that? And one of the services that started at that time was kind of providing a one-to-one to clients that were in programs. And I said, why don't you send the one-to-one in the living room of the family's house and you'll find out what's going on real quick. Why do we remove the child from the situation versus, trying to provide the services to fix the child? Or fix the whole family unit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that you had mentioned in your introduction, Jesse, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on a little bit more. And I know this wasn't in our scripts or our proposed questions, but can you explain what DBT is for those that may be viewing and unfamiliar with that terminology?
Sure. So dialectical behavioral therapy is essentially a holistic toolkit for wellness. So it involves mindfulness, emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. It essentially teaches people to learn to be okay being uncomfortable, or be okay not being okay, which is, I know, something I really related to. I started doing DBT work for someone in my life and then benefited from it greatly, even though it wasn't necessarily designed for me. And then I expanded upon that while I was in prison. So when I was a peer mentor, I worked with other people and I taught them DBT skills. We worked and taught those classes, and it was the most effective tool I saw that we could give to someone to allow them to manage their own behavior, emotions, and interactions with others. So one of my real focuses getting out was, hey, I want to do this. I want to give people the tools that they need so they can manage their own issues. We're not telling them what to do. We're giving them the tools to make better decisions. And the problem that I ran into is I said, okay, I want to go teach these DBT classes. I want to go do trauma-informed care. And what I found was you can't really talk to people about their trauma when they don't have a place to live, or when they have someone trying to shoot them, or when they don't have enough food on the table. So we need to fix the underlying functional structural issues and get people to a place of fundamental safety, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once they have that safety and security, then we can start saying, hey, let's look at your trauma, or let's look at these tools you can use to address it. Because someone who's in flight or fight mode, we can give them all the tools in the world, they're still going to be in fight or flight mode.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, one of the things that I've seen pushed, when a young person is coming out of the juvenile justice system is, they have certain stipulations or, demands to get a job. How is a young person supposed to get a job when they don't have a stable, living situation? They don't have a roof over their head. And I know housing was one of the things that you had mentioned earlier. And, this evening we're kind of, talking about the whole umbrella of mass incarceration and touching on different points. And, housing is a very pressing issue. I know it is in the Boston community, and I'm sure in many other areas of the US as well, and how prevalent of a concern that is of mine. I have seen families that want to move and have stated, I'm in danger of my life, and they have no option of where else to go. And so a young person that may be living there will then choose to be couch surfing or stay wherever, so that they don't have to go back to that very community. um And so I know we were talking about the risks of, having young people return to the community. And I was earlier today, actually, I was reading an article by WBZ that was published in WBZ that said that violence in schools is an escalating problem, but arresting students can have long-term effects. And there was a woman that it quoted, "It's removing you from your family, from your peers, and putting you in a category that's going to continue to perpetuate that identity, and it's going to be more harmful for you coming out." What are the risks of placing children, youth, and young adults into incarceration, facilities, juvenile justice facilities?
Well, so every study that I've ever read says the further someone enters into the justice system, the more basically impact it's going to have on their life, and not for the better. So what we found is diversionary programs are incredibly helpful in not allowing for that stigma or that treatment, not allowing for that label, as you said, because that label is incredibly important. It's both internalized and it's also it also becomes a fundamental part of that person's life. And I spoke at an event that happened here in Charlottesville after this spate of shootings. We didn't have a murder in Charlottesville for 2 years. It was this amazing, period of peace. We had the violence interruption units who were doing amazing work in the streets. And then all of a sudden this gang war happened and all these people got shot. And then we had a shooting at UVA. And so 3 UVA students were killed and the whole city shut down. There were moments of silence. There were honorary parades. And I went to an event and I said, why is it that we have, excuse me, why do we have this moment of silence, but we've never had a moment of silence for a kid shot on Hardy Avenue or over on First Street over in Prospect? Because what we're doing is we're telling those kids that they're not worth remembering. And this just bothers me so fundamentally because it's well-intentioned, but people don't realize the impact of that. When you tell someone they're not worth remembering, you're telling them their life has no value. And we're telling them that by sticking them in a system and saying, you're going to be here, or you're going to be in that graveyard. And we continue to perpetuate this through systemic means and through individual just lapses of judgment or just pure callousness. And the impact is so profound because what I've seen happen both in the adult system and in the juvenile system is when someone is seen and validated and valued and told that they matter, it fundamentally changes the way they interact with other people and the way they see themselves. So I think those labels and that experience is so fundamentally important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the value of human life and young people that, may not receive that love at home or feel valued at home because of various different traumas or child abuse and neglect and, my mom's experience. Uh, but when communities don't value them either, or you have instances like that where the community may do, or friends and family may have a vigil, or you'll be driving down the street and see some candles and a teddy bear on a light pole. But how do we honor those lives and those voices? One of the things that really touches me, as I talked about with housing, I have lost 3 clients to gang violence within the past 2 years. And both of those youth, 2 of those 3 youth, uh, had started their own families, had children, had stable employment, but neither of them had stable housing. And I'm literally getting chills because it bothers me so much to think, if they had the opportunity to find housing outside of their community or outside of the city of Boston, would they still be here? And now there's another child growing up with trauma of not having a parent. And how is that generational pattern going to be, you know, reversed? Or where does that cycle end? And so I definitely agree with the importance of youth voice, because as you mentioned, some of those individuals that are currently in juvenile facilities for shootings or what have you are some of the most creative people that you have met. I am so excited. Tomorrow, actually, am going to be launching a program here in the juvenile facilities in Boston for music. Actually working with a Christian hip hop artist who is going to be coming in and, talking about how we can use our voices and be creative and produce music and also make money off of it and what have you, because I have definitely seen in the city of Boston how music can be detrimental to society and to their peers, but they have a story and a message, and it's just how do they properly say that and be heard and respected, as you mentioned. uh, Uh, so the next area, and I can repeat this twice, which issue out of the following do you see as the most pressing? And if you don't mind explaining a little bit. And so some of them that I have listed here, or if you identify something that I may not have mentioned, feel free to touch on that as well. Economic inequality, racial profiling by police, minimum sentencing on nonviolent crimes, voter suppression, unequal pay for equal work, the draining resources of mental health support, or under-resourced schools. And I can list those again if it's helpful. Um, Economic inequality, racial profiling by police, minimum sentencing on nonviolent crimes, voter suppression, unequal pay, draining resources of mental health support, and under-resourced schools.
I just feel bad because I keep jumping in and I want to let Cheryl have his chance. But I would say two things. First, that I can speak to this, but two, that what we're talking about is a system where each of these things works together. None of them are independent. So to say one is more important than the other is essentially missing the point that they are all fundamentally intertwined. And that if one of them fails, well, the other ones can't necessarily lift that up. It's like a stool or a chair. Like it might be able to stand with 3 legs, but it's going to be a lot stronger with 4 legs or a lot stronger with, 16 legs. But where I'm finding the most kind of passion is under-resourced schools, because we're asking teachers to educate, we're asking them to maintain or manage behavior, we're asking them to be social workers, we're asking them to be counselors, we're asking them to be psychologists. We don't have the resources to treat all the needs of this child. And I'm glad to hear it. It sounds like social services in Boston is more comprehensive than it is here, because essentially social services here just takes your kids away. Like that's it. And they put you in foster care, they put you in a state home, which is not, again, a healing environment. And actually, my next door neighbor, I have to say, is they're the best foster family I've ever seen in my life. They have 6 kids. They put a number of kids through that program. They're absolutely amazing. But I've heard such horror stories. Probably the worst stories I heard from people in prison were people who went through the foster system. That being said, I'm really passionate about schools, and I think that the more we can empower schools and the more we can empower staff and the more we can fund that, because it's a lot easier to raise healthy children than it is to fix broken adults. And I think that if we can continue to have that mindset, we can make a fundamental change early on rather than worry about damage control later.
Amen.
Agreed. I definitely think they're all so related. And the reason I would probably pick the school piece is because you're starting when the children are so young. Not that, when kids come into school at, 5, 6 years old, they've already seen a lot, especially if they haven't been in school prior to that, and you see that with the education, with the various span of knowledge that a 6-year-old has, so if you can try to identify the resources that are needed for each, individual child to be able to build upon that. And like you said, I would agree, it's easier to raise healthier children than try to fix, someone in the criminal justice system as an adult.
Absolutely. Early intervention is definitely necessary and very important. Um, and I'm so thankful that both of you had touched upon the fact that they're all equally important and pressing issues because without your perfect analogy about a stool, they three may be able to balance somewhat with 3 legs, but if you have 4 and a firm foundation, you would have a lot more likelihood in being successful. And as I was gathering these various different things, I often say that in my experience growing up in a suburb of, Milton, Massachusetts, I saw racism at, our front door on the very street that I lived on. And so, a lot of those different things had affected me. And if I didn't have, resources or a mother who supported me and, utilized her voice and was there and fought for me and my brother and my sister, or if we had, I was born in Brockton, only lived there for 2 years, but I wonder, if I grew up in Brockton and in a school system that has, great, sports and is Division 1 in certain sports, but the education and the environment may not be as great, would I have wound up in, some type of system? And so I definitely recognize, the privilege that I have, of having a family that supports me, was, financially stable and what have you. But how many youth don't have that? And if we are able to identify certain resources, like it says, the training resources from mental health is one thing that I have definitely seen increase in the past couple years, especially as you couple that with COVID. I have a family who shared with me that, it wasn't until COVID that her son kind of spiraled downward. And, being removed from so many different sports activities, school, and a normal routine, that he, found himself winding up in trouble in other ways. And I know there is a stigma on mental health, especially in Black and Brown families, where it's something that you don't talk about. But the number of young people that I have had come to me or express their willingness to get mental health counseling, or the wait lists that many people are on or don't have access to. I know for me personally, in receiving mental health support, sometimes the copays and what have you are outrageous. And I'm so thankful for some of the organizations that do provide free counseling, or adjusted models of funding and copays based upon the income level of the family. But mental health is so incredibly important to recognize. And it speaks to the issue of, if you have staff, teachers in school who are expected to not only teach but monitor behavior and all of these other things, they may be implementing social emotional learning, but where is the wraparound services and support? Because mental health is very, very, very important. I know that in terms of voter suppression, that there is a Freedom to Vote Act currently that is ongoing in various different states. And over the last 25 years, it definitely has improved, but there is still work to be done. So I would recommend that anybody that is viewing or from other states that are present to look into the Freedom to Vote Act. It is a Democracy Restoration Act provision that would restore federal voting rights to millions of Americans who live in our communities but cannot vote because of their criminal records.
I was going to say on that note, Virginia is one of 2 states that permanently disenfranchise somebody with a felony conviction, whether they were incarcerated or not, unless the governor directly intervenes. So in 48 other states, there's at least some direct path or some time or some process. In Virginia, it's literally only a gubernatorial pardon that allows someone to get their right to vote back, which I think is egregious. And we had a right to vote bill that passed to put it on the ballot so it would be amended in the Constitution. It passed the first year, and then through like the most devious political shenanigans, it was struck down in subcommittee the next year. And it bothered me so fundamentally that people want to limit other people's voices and don't want people to have a voice in their community. And when we say that out loud, I mean, we're literally like attacking the kind of integrity and the will and the agency of people. And that is the opposite of justice.
Mm, absolutely. Absolutely. And, that just also speaks to mass incarceration. It's largely because of certain policies and, things that are written that cause this very issue. And I didn't know that. And so I thank you, for enlightening me on that. I have a lot of family in the Virginia area, and I definitely want to, continue in conversation and networking with you as well, because, one of the things that I love about Straight Ahead Ministries is we have a national branch, Every Youth, Every Facility, that seeks to provide the gospel to every youth that is incarcerated. And we have various different partnerships across, United States and also some internationally as well. I'm not sure if we currently have any partners in the Virginia area, but I would love to, further that conversation with you. My document froze here that I was looking at for additional questions. Apologize. There we go.
Got it.
So what are the ways, and I want to be mindful of our time, and I can also check in with Elizabeth, who's monitoring the comments, if there's any questions that have come in from those that are viewing with us. But what are the ways the community in which the harm occurred can participate in the restoration of those that have been formerly incarcerated?
I've actually seen that very recently in Boston with, the youth violence that's taking place, and the faith-based communities getting involved, saying even if we ourselves have to kind of man the street type of deal, and, talking about disproportionate areas of as far as the crime and the people that are involved. So I think the community as a whole can definitely get involved and have their voice, especially people using their voice that someone's going to listen to, because that's not always the case with every, person in the community. So I definitely think it can be effective.
Absolutely.
All right. This is a little broader than what you asked, but I mean, this really gets to the core of restorative justice, which is to say, rather than having an offense and punishing someone, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the harm that occurred. And harm always occurs with 3 factors: a community, a perpetrator, and a victim. And there is some role played by everyone in that. It's not to say that we're victim blaming or blaming the community, but there has to be accountability for the actions of the community. Because if a community is okay with a child who, has no food and no one to check on him, so he robs a bank to make sure his little brother has food to eat, the community has a role in that crime, and they need to be accountable for that. We need to look at ways that we can stop this pattern by addressing the issues in the community. So I think the first thing is I think that we also need to look at the needs of the victim and the restoration of the victim, because what we have right now is fundamentally unfair to the victims of crime. Because we say, you suffered here, but rather than asking what we can do to repair that harm or what we can do to provide you the services you need, we're going to focus all of our attention on the perpetrator and then punishing them. And that's going to make you feel better, right? Like, that's not going to get you your money back or get you the treatment you need or get you the therapy you need, but you're going to feel better because somebody's suffering because of you. And it doesn't make any sense. It fundamentally ignores the needs of the victim and then leads to the kind of disintegration of the perpetrator, when the goal of restorative justice is reintegration of all three. How can we bring everyone back? And even if someone needs to be incarcerated, they need to be taken away from society, they need a period of punishment, or they need a period of rehabilitation, the ultimate goal is reintegration. Because if it's not, we're creating a permanent subclass of people who can never participate in society, who can't vote, who aren't welcome, who know they're not valued and know they're not welcome, and who might as well then continue in a life of crime because there's no way back into the good graces of society. So unless we actually say, you can vote, you can participate, we want to invite you, we want to invite you into our communities, we want to see how you can contribute and make our communities better and how we can help you do so. By actually having the mindset of reintegration and having the mindset of restoration, we can invite everyone into a better healing place. But not having that, even for minor offenses, if someone steals a certain amount of money and gets a felony offense, that label will be with them for the rest of their lives. We're not inviting them back into society. We're saying that one thing that you did will define you for the rest of your life. And it's a terrible approach. It's not even like reasonable financially or fiscally or so. There's no justification other than this punishment ethos that seems to permeate our culture for whatever reason.
Mm. I feel like that was like a mic drop. um, and I'm so glad that you touched upon the restorative justice aspect, because that is essentially what the question was kind of leading to. And as I mentioned with the article that I was reading earlier, and if I didn't provide this in the chat for folks that are viewing, we can certainly post it later on or following the event. But there is two organizations actually that I wanted to mention that are doing great work in around the city of Boston. The Transformational Prison Project, which was actually started by individuals that were serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. And also the Charlestown Coalition. They both work in restorative justice models, and it has been very successful from the work that I have seen done. So if any of you that are, viewing are interested, or, us as panelists want to look into those organizations further, I just wanted to mention and uplift those. And so one of the last questions that I have was proposed by Dominique DuBois Gilliard, who wrote the book Rethinking Incarceration that we at BFJN read as a community just last month. So he says that God's justice is relational, not individualistic. Gilliard calls the Christian community to live out the promise of restorative relationships on page 177 of his book. How do we, as those created in the image of God, as it says in Genesis 1:27, play a role in creating this covenant community? And how might a covenant community or a restorative community differ from other forms of community that you may encounter in your day-to-day life? I think he's passing that question on to you.
I mean, community, I think, is a big thing, so any way that you can get everybody involved in the community to take part in that. And, as the question you talked about earlier, psychological or spiritually, I think all of that interfaces with restoring, the community as a whole.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm not sure I have the strongest theological perspective on this, but I guess what I do have is you mentioned groups. There's a group called Equal Justice USA, and they have an evangelical wing, and their goal is nonviolence in all matters. They started as an anti-death penalty group, and now they work for nonviolence in schools, for restorative justice. And I've got a contact I'll give you because they're absolutely amazing. But what they call it is essentially, they say that healing and restorative justice and community repair is the imperative of a Christian. It is the role of a Christian, or the job of a Christian. Because anytime we're dividing, anytime we're kind of like going back to a fractured mindset, we're not living out the will of God, which is to empower us to empower others, to love our brother, like we love ourselves. And I feel like that message is often lost because, unfortunately, often the most divided I see people, as people have said, is on Sunday. And people are divided by their religion, or they're divided by their sect, or they're divided by their race, or they're divided by some factor that, rather than bringing people together, is actually causing this schism. And so my hope is, it's the idea of a covenant community is to say, okay, we're making a promise. We're making a promise of love, of inclusivity, and of repair, because we care about our brother, we care about our sister, we care about the people in our community. So we're willing to invest in them, even if it takes our time. Like, we're not saying, oh, this takes my time, I'd rather watch football on, on Sunday. No, we're saying, how can I invest in them? Because I know they'll invest in me, because we're all invested in each other, essentially because we're all in this together.
Amen. Amen. Absolutely. And, you know, our God, or the God that I serve, um, and it is a forgiving God. And he sees us all in the same, playing field. It's not an othered or subpar, as you had mentioned earlier. And I certainly know, as you mentioned, I'd rather watch, Sunday football or what have you. We are actively, a large branch of Straight Ahead Ministries works with volunteers, where we are, recruiting and training volunteers from across the globe to go into facilities to, whether that's run a Bible study or have a pizza party, or, play card games or basketball in the unit with the guys and girls. Or even if you aren't able to, dedicate your time in that way, how can we support even from outside the walls, whether that's writing birthday cards to young people that are incarcerated. You can not even imagine how much impact that has on a young person, to know that a random person to them actually cares about them and sees them as valuable. And so if anybody's interested in those opportunities, I would love to have a conversation with you further and connect you to the volunteer coordinators of Straight Ahead Ministries, whether that's, here in Massachusetts or across the United States. So as we near a close of tonight's discussion, I just wanted to ask, if there were any resources that either of you would like to recommend for those that are just getting started in understanding and engaging with this issue, or any last things that you wanted to uplift that haven't been spoken about yet this evening.
I don't know about resources directly. I could drop some names or some organizations in the chat, but I've been to a lot of community organizing events. I've been to a lot of summits recently. And the thing that I've asked for at the end of every summit is for people to get involved, and to show up in whatever small way or whatever large way. You can take those old books you have on your shelf, you can donate them to a Books Behind Bars program, knowing they'll get to somebody who needs them. You can show up at the juvenile facility here in Charlottesville. You show up, they can't wait to have you come inside, because you have psychologists delivering trays and trying to do management services because they don't have the staff or the funding. So if you can show up, the smile on those kids' faces when I walked in the second time, because I told them I was going to come back. And I remember when I was incarcerated, if somebody told me they were going to do something and they didn't, I never trusted them again. Like, even I could learn or I could understand, there's a fundamental mistrust, and I didn't come from the same circumstances they did. So I wanted to make sure they knew I would come back. So showing up twice got this kids laughing, got them talking about it. We got an email from the staff saying, we don't know what you did, but this tonight they were arguing about how they were going to get out of the gang life and how they could do things differently and what it would look like. And that's from one conversation. And then from a second conversation, we have even more impact. So please get involved. Take 5 minutes, an hour a day. You can have a huge impact on a child's life, on a person's life. Get involved, invest in your community. It's going to make you richer because of it. The more we lift up, the more we're all lifted up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The richer it will bring you, it will provide for you.
And I'd say, as far as knowledge, in my work that I did, not knowing what the other state agencies did or what the partner agencies did or what the school did. So to try to know what that is and what the resources are and what's available. For me, I just kept asking questions, and I didn't often take no for an answer when there was something that I needed, for that particular child. Sometimes it's transportation, you put a kid in a foster home, you want them to go back to their same school, and someone's told, no, that's too expensive. I often didn't, take no for an answer, find out what those resources are, so that you can keep as much consistent for a kid as possible and then add from there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I thank you both for your time, not only this evening, but what you have done throughout your lives to serve the community, to give back. Jesse, to utilize your voice and, to start an organization that serves others, especially based upon your own experience. I admire the work that you are doing and it's greatly appreciated. Um, I wouldn't be the woman I am today without my mother, who's here, very much followed in her footsteps of human services and justice and serving the community. And so I greatly appreciate you for many different reasons, but for teaching me as well how to utilize my voice, because you have definitely been a woman that always utilizes your voice, especially when it is hard to. And I admire that. I just want to close by saying that we must not only reevaluate the appropriate sanctions in response to crime, but also how to prevent crime in the first place. Investing in restorative and community justice models that heal the harm caused by violence at their root, and creating a system that is survivor centered, accountability based, safety driven, and racially equitable. Experts know that we are all safer when we uplift victims, hold everyone accountable for their actions, and do so with empathy and compassion. Not assume that victims or communities are well served by long term imprisonment. I thank you all for viewing and tuning in with us, whether it's this evening or later on YouTube. I do want to mention that BFJN is a nonprofit. We are a community organization and could not do this without the support of our community. So we thank you for that. And if you'd like to support or know more about our organization or the work that we're doing, please visit our website. Um, Thank you both again so much for your time. And I hope that you both have a great, blessed evening.
Thank you. You too.